Welcome to Key Issue 3 PowerPoint presentation for population. Why does population growth vary among regions is our key issue that we'll be working from today. Let's jump right in. Now we've looked at in our book the demographic transition model. I want to go over this and point out a few really important things and walk us through each stage of it. Now, a demographic transition itself is a process of change in a society's population. And when we talk about the demographic transition model, the DTZ, there are really four stages that countries in our world have gone through, and a fifth stage, which is a projection, which is what we expect some countries to continue into after stage 4. Important to note, once a country progresses through the DTZ, it does not return. Now keep in mind that this is based on stages that European nations for the most part and America and North American nations have gone through. We can't assume that all countries will go through this or even that all countries need to go through these stages, but it has stood the test of time for most countries. Okay, stage 1 is characterized by low growth, meaning the population is not growing very much. And this is the stage that most of human history has been in. Most cultures throughout human history have been in stage 1. In stage 1, the crude birth rate and the crude death rate vary from one year to the next, but over the long term, they're roughly comparable. So the natural increase rate is 0, meaning the population is relatively stable. So the reasons for this vary, but they can include things like famine. If there's a famine or there's a drought or there's war, it may reduce the population, but then there might be very good times when there isn't famine and there's peace and the population starts to grow and build up. But because life is so hard during this time and there's very little technology, most societies did not grow very quickly. And then you have the agricultural revolution. And the agricultural revolution allowed more people to consistently have the food that they need to survive, which allowed populations to grow, because if you have enough food and you have a surplus of food, well, then you can feed more people. And in fact, having more people is helpful, because the more food that you're growing, the more food that you're producing, the more hands you're going to need to do that work. Every nation has moved on to at least stage 2, and so there's not really much more that needs to be said about stage 1, so let's jump over to stage 2. Stage 2 is characterized by high growth. For nearly 10,000 years after the agricultural revolution, world population grew at a modest pace. After 1750, the world's population began to grow 10 times faster than in the past. This increase jumped from 0.05% to 0.5%. And in 1750, the population grew by 500,000. By 1800, it grew by 5 million. Now, I'll run through all these figures, not so that you have to memorize them, because you don't, but so that you see how dramatic of a change this was in stage 2. The population growth occurred because several countries moved to stage 2 of the model, where the crude death rate suddenly plummets, while the crude birth rate remains roughly the same as in stage 1. And so with so many fewer people dying, people are living longer. That means there's more people on Earth. So what's that going to do? It's going to cause the natural increase rate to increase, which is really another way of saying there's going to be more people. Okay? So if fewer people are dying, there's going to be more people. Notice it's not really necessarily because of the birth rate. It's just because the crude birth rate is going down. Countries entered stage 2 as a result of the Industrial Revolution. So we know the Industrial Revolution began in England in the late 18th century and spread to North America in the 19th century, and of course went throughout Western Europe around that time. This revolution resulted in an unprecedented level of wealth, and it helped farmers increase agricultural production to feed the rapidly growing population. So the population can grow for a number of reasons, and agriculture certainly kept step with the growth of the population, allowing it to continue to grow without people dying of starvation for the most part. But the simple fact that agricultural production went up should have also made it easier for people to have more children, because they could expect that those children would have enough food. So this Industrial Revolution cannot be understated as a major factor in global population growth. Countries in Europe and North America entered stage 2 about 1800, but this did not diffuse to most countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America until around 1950. So it was really a whole 150 years later that these other countries moved into this stage. And when we think about the link between a country's demographics and a country's population levels and a country's economy, if there really is a link between those two, then this helps us to explain the wide stratification that we see in the global society between those countries that are more developed, called core countries, and those countries that are less developed, the periphery countries. As far as what the causes are, we can't just simply say that the causes are differences in population levels, because it's hard to tell sometimes cause and effect apart from one another. But at least know that there is some kind of connection, and we'll unpack that more later on. Now, the late 20th century pushes these countries into stage 2, and that's a result of the medical revolution. So the medical revolution eliminates a lot of the traditional causes of death in LDCs. With the medical revolution, you're getting sanitation, okay? Things that bring about diseases that wipe people out, that make people unproductive, and generally make people sick. So things like sanitation, proper nutrition, things like vaccines. Now, we're not even into advanced, what we would consider today to be advanced medical knowledge. We're just talking about the basic stuff, which helps you to have a much better chance of living until an old age. So take another look at this. You've seen it in your book, but this is the model itself. Again, in stage 1, we have very little growth as a result of the birth rate and the death rate not consistently going one direction. And yet in stage 2, because the death rate plummets, and it's plummeting because people have more food, and people, and later on, countries and places like South America and Africa, they have better medical knowledge and practice. So the death rate is going down, and because of that, the total population goes up. Keep in mind that the birth rate doesn't necessarily change too much. There are some countries, and we have studied these, where the birth rate is going very high, right? But overall, it doesn't have to for the population to grow. Okay, stage 3. Stage 3 is characterized by moderate growth. So population is still growing, but not to the extent that it was growing under, or I should say in stage 2. I did a bad job making that. Oh well. Country moves from stage 2 to stage 3 when the crude birth rate drops sharply. Okay, so what accounts for this moderate growth? Why is it not growing as fast as it was in stage 2? Well, the death rate's still going down, but really what's happening is that the birth rate is going down. The crude birth rate declines because of changes in social customs. People are more likely to live in cities rather than the countryside. So because of that, they don't need to have extra children to work the farms. In fact, as we've discussed in class, having a bunch of children around in the city is more a liability. Kids start to cost more money when you're living in a city. You gotta buy more clothes and more food, and pay for education, and pay for extracurricular activities, and pay for more education later on, and housing costs more, rent costs more, all those kind of things. Once you move from an agricultural lifestyle to an urban lifestyle, life costs more money. And the more people you have, the more mouths you have to feed, it gets much more difficult. Also, because in a stage where you're likely to live longer and you have greater access to medicine, you're more likely to see your children live up to adulthood. And so you're not afraid, as many people are in the developing world, for good reason, that their children will not live past 1 year of age. And so you don't feel the need to have multiple children just to ensure that one of them reaches adulthood. Another thing that I don't have typed up here, but we've gone over, is that in stage 3, countries are starting to get institutions by which I should say, older people are taken care of. Not completely necessarily taken care of by the government, but things like Social Security, things like pensions, and banks that you can save money into. And so people are not completely reliant on their children to take care of them once they're older. It is still something that people are looking for. It is still something that people expect. And in the case of China, there are a lot of problems with the one-child policy, but one of them is that you have this rapidly aging population, and they only have one child to take care of them. And that's a lot. That's a large burden on those single children because they're trying to take care of their own lives. Again, the population is still continuing to grow, but it's more modest. The crude death rate continues to fall, but it's falling at a much slower rate than stage 2. Why do you think it's falling at a slower rate? Well, as we talked about in class, there's only so much you can do to keep people alive. And that sounds a little bit draconian, but or a little bit pessimistic, I should say. But there's only so much you can do. If you can get people to beat malaria, and you can get people to beat diseases that are spread person to person, then you can increase their chances of living up to, say, 70 years of age. But beyond that, beyond 70, 80 years of age, there's only so much that modern medicine can do to keep people alive. For instance, we can't completely beat cancer, can't completely beat Alzheimer's. And so these things that set in when people, that usually set in when people get older, we can't completely change the course of those actions. And so because there's only so much you can do, you're not going to slow down you're not going to decrease the death rate by much more, unless of course science makes some radical breakthroughs, which we can hope for, but they haven't happened in a while. European and North American countries moved to stage 3 during the first half of the 20th century. Most countries in Asia and Latin America have moved to stage 3 in recent years, while most African countries remain in stage 2. If you need to pause the video and just read these last 2 bullet points a couple times, I highly recommend that, just because those are things to know. When we're talking about the demographic transition model, we want to know more than just the stages. We want to know where are different parts of the world. How is this model distributed across our globe? Take a look at it again. So we just talked about stage 3. Notice stage 3, the birth rate now drops. And the birth rate is dropping for all those reasons we talked about. When you become a more developed country, or not necessarily most developed, but an industrialized country, people are living in cities where children are no longer an asset. People are less afraid that their children are going to die. People are less worried about having children as their social security net. And of course, as I said, children are an expense. Okay, stage 4 now. So stage 4 is characterized by low growth. A country reaches stage 4 when the CBR declines to the point where it equals the CDR. Okay, so the crude birth rate is going down. We saw that in stage 3, and now it's gone down so much that it's equal to the crude death rate. And so the natural increase rate, of course, if you remember how we factored that using the CBR and the CDR, the natural increase rate approaches 0. Now this condition we call zero population growth. Now, how do you get to zero population growth? Well, when we think about NIR, we can also think about the TFR. Remember, the TFR is the total fertility rate. So we've been talking about how those birth rates decline. The crude death rate is not declining much anymore because, like I said, there's only so much you can do for old people. And the NIR approaches 0. So let's talk about total fertility rate. If you have a total fertility rate in a country of approximately 2.1, then that's going to give you zero population growth. Although we have to think about immigration. If a country gets immigration, then the total fertility rate would have to be lower if you want zero population growth. Now let's talk about why it's 2.1, because this is kind of strange, but it should make sense once I explain it. If it doesn't, we'll talk about it in class. So suppose the total fertility rate were actually 2. Okay, so we call that replacement rate, right? Where 2 people get together, they have 2 kids, and so when those 2 adults move on and die, hopefully many years later, they will have replaced themselves, right? They were brought into the world, they brought 2 more people in the world, and then they left the world. They replaced themselves. So we call that the replacement rate. But it's actually 2.1 and not 2, and here's why. So supposing that if the TFR is 2, that means 2 children per couple, so you can expect all the you can't expect all the female children to survive till childbearing ages, right? So you can't necessarily expect that one of those is going to be a girl and that she's going to survive until she is able to have kids, and that she's even going to have kids, right? And also, history has shown us, biology has shown us that the sex ratio is favorable to boys. This could be for a number of reasons, but science has recently shown that female embryos are less likely to survive, and so those pregnancies often do not happen, do not end well, and so you're more likely to have boys born into society, slightly more likely than girls. So that 2.1, that makes up for it. Kind of weird. Not super important that you understand that 0.1, but if you do, it should help make this all make better sense to you. Again, I can explain that in person with you if you just ask me. Countries in stage 4 can be identified on the map of total fertility rate. Most European countries have reached stage 4 because they have total fertility rates well below 2.1. Okay, so below replacement. In the US, the TFR has hovered around 0 population growth since 2000. So it's been around 2.1. So here we look at total fertility rate. Notice again in Europe it's below 2.0. So they're going to need immigration to keep their population from going down if they're going to stay below 2.0 for a number of generations. Looking back at the demographic transition model, stage 1 through 4, we see that a country, when it passes through all 4 stages of the transition, it's really in some ways completed a cycle. It went from little to no natural increase in stage 1, and then to stage 4, where again it's at little or no natural increase. It's kind of strange and really just kind of amazing that the population goes through these huge changes. The society's population goes through these huge changes, and then it kind of comes back around to where it's not changing very much. But there's 2 major differences. First, in stage 1, the CBRs, the crude birth rates, and the CDRs, crude death rates, are both high, right? So a lot of kids being had, a lot of people dying. Whereas in stage 4, they're both very low. And the second difference is that the total population of the country is much higher in stage 4 than in stage 2, as you see by, actually no, you can't really see that because this is just showing natural increase. But as you can understand, because of all this growth over the stages, over the years. Okay, last thing we're going to cover in this lecture is Thomas Malthus. Now I know you're saying this guy just looks like an English economist, and it turns out that he is, or he was, I should say. So Thomas Malthus, he was an economist. He was also a clergyman. He was, which is basically like a pastor. He claimed that the population was growing much more rapidly than Earth's food supply, because population increases geometrically, whereas food supply increases arithmetically. Basically, what that means is people multiply, but food growth is much slower. Okay, so if 25 years from now there's 4 people instead of 1, there would only be 2 units of food compared to the 1 unit of food at the beginning. So weird, not exactly correct, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. So far he hasn't been correct, but there are some people who still believe in the underlying principle that he espoused, which is we're going to run out of resources. So there are contemporary geographers taking a look at his theory because we have gone through an unprecedented rate of natural increase in the 20th century. Unbelievable. And you've seen the charts of how dramatic it is. So there's 2 characteristics that they argue in favor of regarding his thesis. One is actually not something that he claimed, but it's something that he missed. Even Malthus did not anticipate that relatively poor countries would be the ones that have the most rapid population growth. And in many ways, that's because of the transfer of medical technology from more developed countries. Remember, we said what got many parts of the world into stage 2 and into stage 3 was the medical technology from more developed parts of the world. And you see things like this on TV where they're asking for money to help buy vaccines or mosquito nets, things to help stop these terrible diseases from wiping out more people. Obviously, that is good work, but problem is that it allows people to live longer, but it doesn't help necessarily, and not directly, help increase their economic growth. You can definitely argue that it does, and I would make the same argument overall. And we'll get to that when we study development, because when people are sick, they can't go to work, and so there's really not too much arguing with that. But it's not a necessarily quick and direct way of changing their economy. And history has shown us that, right? You can increase someone's wealth, but not necessarily give them to a better economic standing. And so as a result of this, the gap between population growth and resources is even wider in some countries than Malthus could have ever even anticipated. Also, world population growth is outstripping a wide variety of resources, not just food production. So a couple of geographers or authors, Robert Kaplan and Thomas Homer Dixon, predicted in the future billions of people will be engaged in a desperate search for food and energy, which will result in wars and civil violence over the scarcity of these resources. Maybe. I don't know. I am, like Hans Rosling likes to say, a possibilist. It's possible that it happened, but it's also just as possible that much, much better things will transpire. But what they're getting at here is that it's not just about food, but it's about things that we use in our modern world every day. Resources like oil, land, especially land that's good for agriculture. Water. Fresh water is not something that everyone has complete access to. In fact, we take it for granted here, but water is something that people claim in the future our wars will be fought over. We'll see if it gets to that Mad Max kind of scenario. I certainly hope not. The list goes on. Things like even like wood, lumber, are resources that get stripped away as more and more people start living on the earth. But there's a lot of critics out there of Malthus and of the Neo-Malthusians. One, it's a pessimistic viewpoint. Many geographers consider his beliefs really unrealistically pessimistic. They're based on a belief that the world's supply of resources is fixed rather than expanding. We know that our space on Earth is fixed, but we don't know that our energy is finite. Certain types are, right? We can't go making more coal and oil, at least not realistically. We can't necessarily make more land. Well, actually, if you take a little Google overview look at Dubai, you'll see that they've built islands outside of that city. But that's probably not going to be a solution for any kind of space problems, not for the whole world at least. But so many of our resources are renewable. We're getting into renewable energy. We're able to grow food faster and with less space than we have in the past. So it may be too pessimistic of a viewpoint. It's also, it doesn't really consider technological innovation, right? And I think we can give old Malthus some slack on this. He was living in the late early 1800s, okay? He hadn't really seen the new technology, the new seeds that have been engineered, all the incredible movement that we've made in technology, especially as it relates to agriculture. Population growth could stimulate more ideas for improving technology, which can stimulate economic growth. What that means is the more people you have, the more brains you have out there thinking up new ideas and ways to solve problems, which is kind of a cool idea in and of itself. And there's a critique by the Marxists, and if you haven't learned about Marxism yet, you will at some point. Friedrich Engels, one of the fathers of communism, dismissed Malthus's arithmetic. He said it was an artifact of capitalism, and he argued that the world possessed sufficient resources to eliminate global hunger and poverty if only those resources were shared equally. Now, if you're a student of history, you'll know that the collective farms that were set up under Russian communism as well as Chinese state communism were pretty disastrous, didn't work very well. But the critique itself that if people work together, they can solve problems, I can get behind that. Also, political leaders in Africa, even today, argue that high population growth is good for a country because more people results in greater power. There is something to be said about that. There is power in numbers. Now, as far as sub-Saharan Africa goes, we will see if these countries have what it takes to make their countries sustainable for those massive populations. If there's going to be jobs for everyone, it could really, truly be a great thing for them. But time will tell. All right. Lastly, I just want to look at his theory versus reality. Conditions in the past half century just haven't supported his theory. Even though the world population has grown at a faster rate than ever, whole food production has also consistently grown. And it's grown at a faster rate than the natural increase rate since the 1950s. So basically, we're making more food than we are people at a faster rate. Many people in the world cannot afford to buy food. Okay, that is a real problem. But to be fair, that's more a problem of the distribution of wealth, the distribution of resources, rather than insufficient global production of food, as Malthus had predicted. So is there a problem? And is the problem linked to population? Yes, absolutely. But note that it's really more about distribution. And we'll talk a little bit later about distribution of wealth, distribution of resources and food. You know, the United States throws away food that we make because we grow too much. But it's often not as simple and easy as just shipping that food elsewhere. Besides the fact that a lot of food is perishable, you have the reality that if a country becomes completely dependent on receiving food from another land, businesses in that country will fail because there's no way to compete with free. And if that doesn't quite ring a bell with you right now, that's fine. We'll get to it when we study development. For now, we'll leave off with a thought from Neo-Malthusians that there's only so much more food that you can produce. So they are still arguing that yes, food production has ramped up. It has been growing at an incredible rate, but at some point you're going to run out of space and you just can't grow food overnight. Well, they say that, but we've seen some incredible things in the past, and we'll see what happens in the future. I don't know that I would want food that was grown overnight, but I guess I could start eating bamboo. Okay, sorry this one was kind of bland. No funny images or uh, not even any bad jokes. I could have at least thrown in like 2 bad jokes, but I wanted to get through it quickly for you. So we'll move on, and maybe the next one will be a little bit more lively.